I'm just pulling up my notes that I somehow failed to print out.
Okay,
All right.
you're gonna want to mute because we're live.
I may need to pull up my screen to do the intro. So you can still see me if I do that, right? Like now. I can be speaking and that's cool.
You're good, yeah.
Okay. Mm.
Good morning, everyone. We're gonna get started in just another minute. Give everyone a chance to get in here. Okay, everyone, I think we can get started. All right, good morning, everyone. We'd like to welcome you to the 2020 CRSP Fall Institute. That's the Center on Race and Social Problems. I am Jay Hughley. I am the interim director here at the center. And on behalf of the University of Pittsburgh, the Office of the Provost and the School of Social Work, we would like to welcome you to this event. You may know that the University of Pittsburgh is a national leader in race equity conversations around anti-Black racism. And the Center on Race here is one of the focal points of the work that we do. We're an interdisciplinary center. We're supported by the Office of the Provost, and we're housed in the School of Social Work. And today is one of probably the most important events we've held. Everyone is talking about this election and how very important it is to the future of the country. Today, we're not here to tell you who to vote for. We're really not here to do that. That's everyone's own choice and prerogative. What we want to talk about today is actually making sure that you're able to vote, that you have your right to vote, that you have the methods and know how to get to the poll, that everything is intact for you. Part of that is knowing the history of what's happened in this country around voting and race. Part of that is discussing, our political entities and how they've reached out and engaged us. And part of that is the bedrock knowledge of the voting process, voter protection, and voting rights. And we'll be touching on all of those today. We're super excited for this morning session. Our center conducts and disseminates applied social science research that advances racial equity and racial justice. You can follow us on our socials. And some notes before we get started today. Many of you may be interested in continuing education units. We are able to afford those. You will get a Zoom email follow-up for those credits. This event is also simulcast on facebook.com/BigCrisp. So let all of your friends, family, colleagues know that they can follow it. It's all free. We have these 3 sessions during the day, but there's content all day that can be followed. You all, because you're in this live session, are the closest to us and the presenters and can send your questions anytime, not until, you don't have to wait until the end. But you can send them anytime via the Q&A mechanism. And we'll get to them. We will do Q&A at the end, but we'll receive the questions throughout the session. Today's lecture is being recorded and will be made available shortly thereafter on our YouTube channel as well as Facebook. So with no further ado, I want to jump into this content, and we're very, very honored to have with us one of our great Pitt professors, Professor Jesse Allen, who is going to introduce our keynote speaker, also incredible. Well, Professor Allen teaches jurisprudence, legal ethics, property, and a course on rights, theory, and practice. Her current scholarship considers how traditional legal authorities and practices might contribute to a distinctive rule of law other than by determining substantive legal outcomes. Professor Allen's writing and teaching is informed by her experience as a litigator and a civil rights advocate. Before coming to Pitt in 2010, Professor Allen worked for several national public interest organizations and at the U.S. Department of Justice, where she was a Bristow Fellow in the Office of the Solicitor General, the branch of the DOJ that handles federal government's cases in the United States Supreme Court. As a senior attorney for the Advancement Project, a racial justice organization, she litigated voting rights cases in swing states. Before that, she was a staff attorney at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law, where her practice focused on challenging states' laws that bar voting because of criminal conviction. Professor Allen received her doctorate in law from Columbia University, where she was a Heffernan Fellow, and her JD from Brooklyn Law School. I want to welcome our esteemed colleague and professor, Jessie Allen. Thanks for being with us today.
Well, thank you for that too extended for my contributions here today, but I am delighted to be here today, mainly to listen, because I think it's so important to consider the interdisciplinary approach to what is and has always been, in my view, the problem of our country, which is race, and how no single approach can deal with this, right? So to listen to an economist like Dr. Williams unpacking the history and the connections to the economic issues while we're all pretty focused on the political voting side, as Dr. Hughley said, I think is just a fantastic opportunity. So I'm here to listen and to introduce Dr. Williams, which I'm going to do right now. Dr. Jhacova Williams is an associate economist at Rand Corporation, and she's an applied microeconomist. And she focuses primarily on economic history and cultural economics. So you already have this great interdisciplinarity built into her work. And previously in her scholarship, she's examined Southern culture and the extent to which historical events have affected political behavior and economic outcomes of Southern Blacks. Again, this to me fascinating cross-cutting approach between history, politics, and economics. Recent examples of this include historical lynchings and the political participation of Blacks and Confederate symbols. We're all familiar with the movement to take down statues, for example, and labor market differential. So interesting to, again, cross-cut that cultural, symbolic statue with the nuts and bolts labor market issues. She's also done a series of projects investigating the role of structural racism in shaping racial economic disparities in labor markets. So they're an approach toward discrimination and how that is working economically. Her work has used various research designs to assess causal effects, and she received her doctorate from Louisiana State University, LSU. And so I guess without further ado, we're going to hear from Dr. Williams.
All right, thank you so much. First of all, I just want to say thank you all for inviting me. Thank you, Dr. Hughley. It was so great meeting you. I'm so happy that you even invited me to this presentation. Dr. Allen, you gave a great introduction. I love the fact that you explained it because I feel like a lot of times people don't understand how great it is to do interdisciplinary work. And I encourage it. So for any students that's out there, always interdisciplinary work. I love it. All right, so let me share my screen so we can get to the meat and potatoes of why we are here. First thing, let me just minimize everything so I can make sure. All right, so we see the screen and let me just one thing. Okay, perfect. So here to talk about historical lynchings and the Black vote to date. So one thing I want to talk about is I am talking about history, which means that there are going to be some racially sensitive language and things that you're going to see. So just want everyone to be prepared for that. As Dr. Allen said, Jhacova Williams, I'm associate economist at Rand Corporation. I think this is like my first month there. So I'm excited to start a new job, excited to be here to talk about this paper. I've been working on this paper for a while. And so let's get to like the meat and potatoes. What's the foundation? How do I motivate this? The foundational model of voting comes from Anthony Downs, in which he said, and where he says that people vote whenever the benefit of voting outweighs the cost of voting. Yet recent empirical findings have actually shown, hey, voting is more of a social norm. Why do people do it? Because others will ask them. They want to be able to get that I voted today sticker, which hopefully we all are going to do by November 3rd, right? Going to get that sticker and tell all their friends and family members, I participate in my civic duty. I'm a great American citizen. It's also been shown that voting is habit forming, and that voting one election increases the likelihood that an individual will vote in future elections. The most recent empirical finding shows that there's this intergenerational transmission of voting behavior, meaning that if a parent votes, their child is more likely to vote in a recent election, right? But what happens if a certain group of people are not as motivated to get that I voted today sticker, and they don't vote, and their parents didn't vote, and their parents didn't vote, and their parents didn't vote? And all of this is actually rooted in historical racial animus. So what I actually do is I'm actually going to say that voting is an area to be studied by cultural economics. I know some people are like, what does that even mean? And so I'll get to what cultural economics is and why this actually feels and falls into the line of economics. The question that I'm going to ask is there a link between historical racial animus and the contemporary voting behavior of Blacks? To kind of get to the punchline, because you may be thinking historical racial animus, how do you measure that? Right? What I'm actually going to do, my research design is I'm going to use historical lynchings to proxy historical racial animus in an area. And I'll tell you why I think that that's a good proxy in a minute. Right? Just to give a preview of my findings, what do I find? Waha, there is a relationship, right? That's why there's a paper. That's why I've been working on this for years. That's why I'm here presenting today, right? There is this relationship. And so I actually show that for one standard deviation increase in historical lynchings, voter registration rates today are reduced by 2 percentage points. What's the mechanism? Cultural voting norms, right? It doesn't exist for whites or other minorities. You only see it existing for Blacks. And when I say Blacks, I mean Black Americans, right? So Blacks who were born in this country and their parents were born in this country. You don't see it for foreign-born Blacks, Native Americans, Asians, or Hispanics. Right. So one thing I want to say as well before I actually get into the paper, I just want to say I know that this is a diverse background, so I'm going to have all types of stuff. I'm going to have, yes, the mathematical side, I'm going to have the graphs, and I'm going to have the history. So just come along with me on a ride, right? We're going to make sure that we feed everyone and just make sure that everybody's okay. All right, so just to give an outline of what I'm going to talk about today, brief literature review, historical background of why I think lynchings are a good proxy for historical racial animus, my conceptual framework, how am I connecting the past to the present, right? How is that working? Empirically, how am I going to estimate that? The data that I use, my results, and then finally conclude. Right? So cultural economics. Again, a lot of times whenever I talk about what I do, people are like, I thought economists looked at the stock market. I'm confused. Like, how are you talking about lynchings and voting, right? I'm confused. How is this economics? So I want you all to think about economics in this way, right? In economics, what we're trying to do is we're really examining people's behavior. We're trying to see how people are incentivized or disincentivized to do certain things, right? So it's one of those things where you look at consumer behavior, you may look at producer behavior. With this new strand of economics, and it came around about 15 to 20 years ago, and they said, hey, what if people are influenced by culture? Right. So yeah, we talk about all these different things, labor market outcomes, but what if people are influenced by the culture? So think about a mini example would be, what if you actually come from a developing country and you're a woman and you actually can participate in the labor force, but because of your cultural views, you do not participate in the labor force. You actually told, hey, no, you're supposed to be in the kitchen, cook and clean, raise the kids. That's it. Right. How does that actually affect labor market participation among women in that country because of that culture? Right. So people started having views and saying, wait a minute, people are making decisions, but they may be making decisions based on their culture. And culture may be rooted in historical acts and things that happened in the past that created a culture. All right. So what am I talking about? There's 3 papers that I'll talk about that kind of, I would say, were the front runners for cultural economics. The first is Nunn and Washington in 2011. What they actually do is they find a negative relationship between slave exports and measures of trust over 400 years ago. So what they actually find is that if you actually interview Africans today who live in areas where they were heavily targeted by the slave trade, individuals who live in those areas and actually belong to those ethnic groups that were heavily targeted by the slave trade, they're less trusting of their family members, their friends, government institutions, and things of that nature. Now you may say, okay, well, what does that have to do with economics? Well, again, if you're less trusting, guess what that may mean? You may not actually trust institutions. You may not put money in banks. You may actually believe that everyone's corrupt, right? And so again, it may actually cause you to behave a certain way. Vorlander and Voth also have a paper in 2012 in which they identify anti-Semitic views that have persisted over 500 years. So to kind of give like a brief historical background with this, the Black Death happens, I want to say in 1348 to 1352, or the Black Plague, as some people call it. All right, over 1/3 of Europe's population died. For whatever reason, people blame the Jews. No evidence of anything, but for whatever reason, people just said, hey, the Jews actually poisoned the whales. And what did they do during that time? They went around killing Jews during this historical time period. What they find is that if you fast forward 500 years later, those same areas that were attacking Jews during the Black Death, they were more likely to support Hitler and the Nazi Party during his reign. And they were more likely to actually attack Jews around that 1920 time period. Achari et al. Is the last paper I'll talk about, and they find political attitudes among Southern whites can be traced to the prevalence of slavery. So again, they find this culture of, in a sense, these anti-Black views. So what they actually find is that whites who actually live in Southern areas today that had more slaves in the past, that they are less likely to identify as Democrats, that they are more likely to oppose affirmative action, and they're more likely to say that they hold racial resentment towards Blacks. Right. So this is the whole field of cultural economics. Again, it's really in a sense saying, are people behaving a certain way because of a culture? And did that culture come out of some type of racial tension, some type of historical acts, right, that had created that culture? And you see that that behavior is persisting among a certain group of people, right? So what am I talking about? All right, so I'm going to actually say, hey, we're going to focus on America in this paper. In particular, I'm going to look at the South. Why? Because the Reconstruction Act of 1867 forever changed the voting population in the South. So basically what happened was you have the Civil War, the South loses to the Union, right? Confederacy loses to the Union. And the Union actually says, hey, in order for you to be readmitted to the Union, you have to redo your Constitution. And you have to include what's called manhood suffrage. Manhood suffrage gave over 1 million Blacks the right to vote, Black men. And over 300,000 illiterate poor whites were given a right to vote. All right, and so during this time period, Union Army commanders started to protect manhood suffrage. And the Freedmen's Bureau was quoted saying that they advised Negroes about registration and voting and disabused their minds of fears of taxation, of military service, or re-enslavement. What is that saying? That is actually saying that this was the most democratic election that you would ever have seen. Right? They actually protected people's rights to vote. So again, they gave Black men a right to vote and they protected it. What do you think happened? Crazy. Voter turnout among Black men was between 70 and 90% during this first election. Now, I want you to stop and think about that for a second, right? Today, voter turnout is not that high among any racial group in the United States. So we're talking about you're giving Black men a right to vote, and they're voting, nearly 90% of them are voting. And when they're voting, who do you think they're voting for? Right? They're voting for other Black people to be politicians, to fight for equal rights, right? And they're also voting for white Republicans, which I should say at the time was the Liberal Party. So let's just be clear, they were always on the Liberal Party side. The party's changed, right? So you can actually see during this time period, Blacks made up the majority of some of the state delegates, 61% in South Carolina, 50% in Louisiana, and 40% in Florida, right? So again, you have Black people, they have the right to vote, Black men are voting, and they're voting other Black men into office, right? And so what this did was this changed the political structure of the South. And this angered a lot of white Southerners, in particular the KKK. So Balak comes up with a political threat hypothesis in which the dominant group believes their political authority is being tested by the subordinate group. And what do? Violence arises, right? And so that's exactly what you see. Violence arises to suppress the Black Republican vote at the time. The KKK killed more than 2,000 Blacks in South Carolina, 2 South Carolina legislators, and the president of the Union League, which is an organization that helped to register Black men. In just a matter of 2 years, voter turnout among Blacks was reduced by 20%. And you see it to continue to decline, all right, during post-Reconstruction era. So this is just a scatter plot of what I have. So what I want to show here is on my x-axis, I have the percentage of Black registered voters. And on my y-axis, I have the number of Black lynchings during this historical time period. What is it showing? This is showing that where there's a higher percentage of Blacks that were registered to vote, sorry, let's back up. Higher percentage of Blacks that were registered to vote, you actually see that there were more Blacks that were lynched during this time period. So you're seeing really, in a sense, where Black people are registered to vote, those areas are being targeted by lynchings in the later years to come, right? So you're first seeing, again, this relationship happening with what I would say is racial violence, racial terror in regards to suppressing the Black vote. So one lynching that I'd like to highlight, and that's only because I feel like we should always honor people who were brutally murdered. One is Emmett Till, right? So Emmett Till, 14-year-old boy from Chicago, comes to Mississippi to visit his family members, right? Supposedly he whistles at a white woman. He's dragged out of his uncle's house. He's tortured, beaten, killed, dumped in a river, right? His body is found a few days later. They arrested two guys who were accused of killing him. The two murderers were not convicted. They were found not guilty by an all-white jury. And a couple of days later, they were paid by a magazine to talk about the murder. Because of double jeopardy, they knew they couldn't be tried again. So they said, hey, well, yeah, let's tell it. We did. Yeah, we were found not guilty, but we actually did kill him. And they talked about why they did it. The thing that's interesting about this, and I kind of like to always break it from the story to kind of talk about this and put myself in this. I remember being in the 3rd grade and seeing the picture of his casket. And I'm not going to show it only because to me it is graphic. And I remember being a 3rd grader and immediately my teacher showed me that and I immediately started crying. And I remember, again, all of my classmates, we were all wondering like, what's going on? Why did this happen to a child? And I remember hearing a narrative of, oh, because he whistled at a white woman. He whistled at a white woman. And I remember that narrative constantly being played over and over and over again. But the truth about it is, his killers, the first reason why they actually mentioned that they killed him was because of voter intimidation. One of his killers actually was quoted again talking to this reporter in a magazine and said, but I just decided it was time a few people got put on notice. As long as I live and can do anything about it, niggers are gonna stay in their place. Niggers ain't gonna vote where I live. If they did, they control the government. What I think that's so interesting about this lynching is that, again, even when you ask people today, and you talk about Emmett Till, again, the whole idea of him whistling at a white woman still remains, even though his killers actually admitted that he was killed because of an act of voter intimidation. And again, the first thing that they brought up was, hey, we have to stop these people from voting. What's also interesting about his story is that Emmett Till was 14, which means he was not of voting age. Right. And so one thing to know about these lynchings as well is that they targeted women and children, people who actually were not given a right to vote, to actually suppress the Black vote during this time period. All right, so I gave you a lot of historical background, but you may say, okay, well, you said we're talking about voting today, right? You're saying something about November 3rd. What the crap? Come on, let's fast forward. How are we getting there? Right. So my conceptual framework builds on existing voting models and cultural anthropology. Remember that people vote whenever the benefit of voting outweighs the cost of voting, right? The cost of voting is comprised of logistical costs. So that's the cost of getting to the poll, standing in line, right? Casting your ballot. Information cost, which is the cost associated with gathering information about an election. So, when is election date? Who's running for office, right? What I'm hypothesizing is that the cost of voting was extremely high during a historical time period. Because you could be killed, you could be lynched, and Blacks knew this, right? So they began to develop rules of thumb to tell them what they should do to protect their own well-being, which was, hey, just become totally apathetic to the voting process. I'm fearful, I don't want to die, so you know what? I just don't even want to vote. And what I hypothesize is that lynching successfully changed the behavior pattern among Blacks, and that has been passed down from generation to generation to generation. So let me just stop here and say, I'm not saying that if you ask Blacks today, why didn't you vote in an election? They're not going to say Billy Bob was lynched 100 years ago and that's affected me. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that this person didn't vote, and their parents didn't vote, and their parents didn't vote, and their parents didn't vote. And so their great-great-grandfather did not vote because Billy Bob was lynched. He became totally apathetic to the process. And because voting is a social norm, those things were passed down. And so again, it's almost in a sense like this culture of voter apathy and among the Black community was passed down. So empirical framework, what I want to do is estimate the relationship between historical racial animus and contemporary voting behavior of Blacks. So this is something I've kind of already talked about. Basically, I want to, in a sense, run a regression. I have current voter registration rates, and I'll talk about where I get that data from in a second. And I want to have a measure of racial animus. What I'm going to do again is actually use lynchings as a measure of historical racial animus for the reasons that I gave earlier. Right? I'm going to have a set of historical controls, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And the voter registration rate is going to be the percentage of Black registered voters per Black voting age population. I'm only going to focus on registration, and that's only because that is the first thing you have to do is to register. But if we look at voter turnout, we get similar rates, right? And then I also would have a lynching rate, which would be the number of Blacks who were lynched per Black population in 1900, looking at that historical time period. So my data, just for people who are data hungry, data driven, and I just want to look at my time, cool, to make sure I'm good. So my lynching data comes from the Historical American Lynching Data Collection Project. So they actually have data from 1882 to 1930. So one thing to say is that people usually ask me like, oh, did you collect this lynching data? I'm like, no, I did not. So one thing to know about lynchings as well is that they were public spectacles. A lot of times they talked about it in newspapers. And so they would advertise and they would say certain things like, hey, in 3 days, Billy Bob will be lynched at this corner. Or they would say 3 days ago, Billy Bob was lynched. So what the NAACP started to do was actually collect that data, right? And the Historical American Lynching Data Collection Project actually came together and cleaned that data set. And so that's where I get the data from. What I want to do as well is kind of look at and try to get into whether or not these areas that had lynchings were different. And so what I want to do is try to get some economic indicators. So I'm going to look at the average, I'm going to control for the average farm value, the proportion of small farms, the proportion of free Blacks, and that's going to come from, again, this historical time period. The proportion of free Blacks is getting at norms about race, right? If there's a higher percentage of free Blacks, this area may be a little different. I'm also going to control for land inequality, the number of newspapers and the year in which a county was formed. And these are going to be proxies for institutional quality. Now, my contemporary data. Contemporary data is administrative data. It comes from the Secretary of State offices in Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, North Carolina, and South Carolina. And I'm actually looking at the contemporary, the current time period, 2000 to 2012. I'll tell you all once I end why I didn't look at 2016, but there's no hocus pocus behind it. But there's a reason why I didn't look at 2016 and didn't include it. So I only have 6 states out of the 11 states in the former Confederacy. And the reason why is because these are the 6 states in which when people register to vote, they identify their race, right? And so the Secretary of State can actually separate Black registered voters, Black people who voted, white registered voters, white people who voted, right? And I also have the number of Blacks who are of voting age from SEER and for the same presidential elections, right? So I'm gonna just show, and I show this because again, I'm used to talking to economists and a number of people who wanna see everything. So I'm just showing this, but the main things you wanna show, and this is the stuff that I have in bold. What I have here is that you can see 75% of Blacks are registered to vote, whereas 76% of whites are registered to vote. You may say, well, those numbers are really close. I mean, why are we even talking about this right now? Because there's no huge disparity. I call this the Obama effect. Right? Remember, I have 2008 and 2012 in my sample. This is usually about between 10 and 12 percentage points difference. So this is actually close because of those years, because of those Obama years. And the number of Blacks that were lynched during this time period in a county on average is about 3. And the Black lynching rate on average is about 3.6. Right? All right, so this is just a map of the lynchings. So this is actually showing the number of lynchings across counties. What you should notice, again, we have the lighter pink to the darker pink. So you can see that you have anywhere from upwards of 25 people that were lynched in a county during this time period, from 0 to 25. What you should notice is that you don't see that a lot of light pinks at all, right? So you see that most counties had at least one lynching, And again, I want you all to remember, these were big public spectacles, right? So it's not this thing where, oh, it's only one lynching. No, I mean, this is something, this is huge. This is huge. I just want to make sure everybody understands that. So when you're talking about an area that has 25, okay, I hope everybody gets that, all right? What I do is I normalize about the Black population. Now, why am I doing that? Because the thing is that even though we're talking about the number of lynchings, it really matters of how many people resided in that area, right? Because you're really trying to think the threat to lynchings. So what I'm going to do is divide it by the Black population in that time, just so I can actually see like, hey, is there a difference? And you should notice that if you look at the first map, notice that you kind of see these darker pinks in the northern part of, say, for instance, Louisiana, versus now you kind of see them more towards the southern part of Louisiana. And again, this is more of a threat to violence. So again, I'm actually doing this to say, like, based on how many Black people were in the area, how many people were lynched. And notice that this lynching rate goes from 0 to 159. So this is actually saying 159 people were lynched per 10,000 Black population in that area, right? So this is kind of like what you can see as a murder rate. This is equivalent to a murder rate. All right, so what do I find? Right, did a lot of talking. Let's get to the graphs. Let's get to the numbers. All right, what do I find? First thing is, if you look at this first graph, On my x-axis, I have, again, this Black lynching rate. And then I have the percentage of Black registered voters. What you should notice is that, again, as I go along this x-axis, what do you see? Sharp decline. So what this is saying is that where there are a higher number of lynchings in the past, there are fewer Blacks who are registered to vote, right? So again, you see this negative, statistically significant relationship. What am I doing on this second graph? I'm actually doing what's called a falsification exercise. So one thing about lynchings is that 90% of the victims who were lynched during this historical time period were Black, right? So you shouldn't really see a relationship with any other racial group, right? And that's what I'm doing with this second graph. Notice that, again, I have Black lynchings here. If I look at the percentage of white registered voters, notice how this is really a flat line. And I should tell you that the estimates are close to zero and statistically insignificant. So what this is saying is that, yes, you see that these lynchings have a relationship with the targeted group 100 years later, almost 100 years later, I should say, right? So because I'm usually talking to economists, and I don't know if any of you all have ever done with economists, but we're a weird group of people. And I still am looking at my time to make sure I'm good, but we're a very weird group of people, right? Which means I can't show economists that graph and then say, okay, that's it. Because they're going to say, no, there's other stuff going on. Don't believe you, keep going. So what's my keep going? It could be other things that's driving this relationship, potential confounders. First is I could look at is contemporary stuff that's going on, right? So you're saying it's something in the past, but maybe it's something today is going on as preventing these Blacks to register vote and getting them to vote. So a few things could be proportion of Blacks that have college experience, the age of Blacks, the proportion that are married, and monthly earnings. Why am I including these things? Because education, age, marital status, and income have all been shown to be correlated with voting propensities, right? So it could be one of those things where like, no, hey, listen, there's just fewer Blacks that have some college experience or more. Blacks may be younger in these areas. They may be less likely to be married. They may have lower earnings. And that's what's causing this relationship, right? So that's the first group of potential confounders I want to look at. The second group I want to look at is Republican Party dominance. Remember, I'm looking at 6 southern states. Right? These are red states. I'm from Louisiana. That's where the accent comes from New Orleans. All right. So is it one of those things where Blacks who live in these areas know Donald Trump's going to win the election? I already know I live in a red state. So what's the point in me registering to vote? What's the point in me voting? I already know who's going to win. And so what I'm going to actually do is create a measure of Republican Party dominance. And what I'm going to do is basically say that measure is going to be the share of votes awarded to the Republican nominee minus the share of votes awarded to the Democratic nominee in the year prior, right? So again, thinking that people are looking backwards and going, hey, I know Donald Trump won in 2016, so I can predict in 2020 he's going to win again. In a sense, is that going on? And do you see that Blacks are refraining to vote since they think that their vote won't be pivotal in these areas? The next thing, incarceration rates. Blacks have high incarceration rates, especially in the South. Guess what you can't do when you're incarcerated? Vote, register to vote, right? So is it again that Blacks just have high incarceration rates in the South? And that's really what's driving your relationship. It's not these lynchings, it's this other stuff. Right? What about polling places, right? And so it could be, hey, there's a fewer polling places in some of these areas. And that's really what's driving your relationship because some people can actually register to vote at the polling place. So is that why you're seeing this relationship? And then the last one, which is the elephant in the room, slavery, right? You're talking about all this historical stuff, but you never said slavery. And there's been research to show that slavery left behind formal and cultural institutions that make it difficult for Blacks to vote today. So is it that it's not lynching, it's really slavery. It's really that these areas that participate in the slavery are just different. And that's why you're seeing this, right? So what do I have? All right, what I'm gonna do is, and again, for people who like graphs, I'll show a graph in a second, but for people who like tables, let's get to the table first. What I'm gonna do is kind of just go through each potential confounder. And what I'm doing is seeing whether or not my model is sensitive, right? Is it gonna change my results, right? So notice that what this is actually saying is that when you have a higher share of Blacks that have college experience and more, voter registration rates go up, right? Higher monthly earnings goes up. If there is a stronger Republican Party dominance, you do see that voter registration among Blacks goes down, right? Incarceration rates, higher incarceration rates, voter registration goes down. More polling places, voter registration rates go up. And more slavery or more slaves in the past, voter registration rates go up. So things go in a way in which you think, except slavery, right? And the reason why this is the case, and I actually had to kind of tease this out, was because Blacks live in areas where they're clustered in areas where there was a higher slave proportion. And what you're seeing is, in a sense, when Blacks live in areas where there are more Blacks, they're more likely to participate to vote, right? They feel like I'm around more like-minded individuals, right? So this last column is what we really care about. Right? What this is actually showing is that when I include all of these potential confounders, all of these things that could be driving this relationship, what do you still see on Black lynching rate? You still see this negative, statistically significant relationship. And I want you to see how, again, I'm starting from, say, 0.5, and I'm going down to 0.4. So what is this saying? It's saying that, hey, yes, do they do a little bit of explaining? Yes, but the relationship still exists. You still see that negative relationship, right? And I see I'm coming a little short on my time, so I'm going to kind of push through. So graphically, what am I saying here? The first two graphs are what we saw before. So the first two graphs are not including any of those potential confounders. So remember, we have this negative relationship between Black lynchings and the percentage of Black registered voters. And we have really no relationship between Black lynchings and a percentage of white registered voters. Now, what I'm doing here is actually including these potential confounders. What you should notice is that this line is a little flatter than this line. Again, saying, hey, yes, it explains a little bit, right? But still steep, still negative, still statistically significant. So again, it's still something else going on, right? So could it be geographic sorting, right? That's another elephant in the room. People choose where they live. And so could it be that during the Great Migration, Blacks migrated away from these violent Southern counties that they were experiencing lynchings? And what remains are Blacks that maybe just had lower voting propensities. And that's what happened. Right. And so what I want to do is examine whether Black migrants out of and into Southern counties with higher lynching rates differ. So what I'm basically trying to see is, again, the Blacks who migrated away from these areas, are they different from the Blacks that remain? Again, what I'm going to do is kind of just push to the results, and just because I want to make sure I'm good on time so you can see everything. So what we're looking at here is just this first row. This first row is actually telling me the people who migrated out of these areas, do they differ from people who remained in these areas as a function of lynching rates? What does this say? This is actually saying that out migrants had lower wages, they were a little older, they were less likely to be female, they had higher levels of ninth grade education, they were more likely to be employed full-time, and they paid lower rent. But what you should notice is that all of these things are close to zero, and the only one that's statistically significant is female, right? So what this really is saying is that you don't see this relationship where out migrants in these areas that have Black lynchings are different from people who are not migrating out of these areas, right? The next thing I want to look at is whether or not there's contemporary barriers, right? Because I'm talking about all of these things, but could it just be that, hey, listen, these areas that had historical lynchings, something was wrong with them, obviously. And could it be that those same areas are doing something today to stop Blacks from voting? So again, it's still not the lynchings, but it's really in a sense that the areas that had these lynchings are just doing something today. And so what I'm going to see is whether or not I want to see whether or not this could be a potential barrier. And what I'm going to look at, and matter of fact, what I'm going to do is skip here, just again to make sure I'm good with time. What I'm actually going to do is look at where polling locations are, where polling places are in an area. So this is a map of Louisiana, and each dot actually represents a polling location. What you should notice is that you see these clusters, right? You see these clusters, This is where there's a high population density. So right here in Louisiana, this is where I'm from, this is Orleans Parish. So you see that there are more polling places where there's more people, there's a more cluster of people, right? I want to see whether or not, and what I'm really trying to see is whether or not these polling places differ as a function of the proportion of Blacks who live in these areas. So really I'm trying to say, hey, listen, is it that these areas that have more lynchings, do they have fewer polling places in areas where Blacks reside, right? And again, I'm kind of skipping over some of this stuff, and I apologize. I just want to make sure we can get to the questions. All right, what is this saying? So I want to go through this table just so people can understand what these numbers mean. And again, we really care more about the sign and the significance, really is what I really want to talk about. What this is saying is that where there's a higher proportion of Blacks, there are fewer polling places, which is why you see this negative sign. Where there were more Black lynchings, there are fewer polling places. But you do not see a relationship, a statistically significant relationship, and it's close to zero, between these areas that had higher Black lynchings, had a higher Black lynching rate, and that they have more Blacks today. right? You do not see that these areas that have more lynchings have fewer polling places in areas where Blacks reside. And that, in fact, they actually have a positive relationship, not a negative relationship. Right? All right. So what's going on, right? I believe that is, again, cultural voting norms that have been passed down from generation to generation. And so again, if lynchings discourage political participation, that behavior may have been passed down among Blacks. So I'm actually going to use a data set, Southern Focus Poll from 1992 to 2001. And there's a question that asks, when you were growing up, how important was it to your parents that you be patriotic, right? What do you see? For Blacks, you see that they actually are less likely to say that it was important, all right, for them to be patriotic. And again, this is actually looking at areas in which they had these high lynching rates. What do you see for whites? You see no relationship. What do you see for other minorities? Again, close to zero, in this long line across this red line is actually saying it's statistically insignificant. So what this is saying is that, again, you're only seeing this relationship among Blacks. It's this negative and it's statistically significant relationship. So in conclusion, and I see I'm a tad bit over my time, but again, we're going to conclude real quick. So what is it showing? Showing that lower voter registration rates can be traced to historical lynchings. It's unlikely to be driven by Republican Party dominance, incarceration rates of Blacks, institutions that remained after slavery, geographic sorting, contemporary barriers to voting. What is this all saying? That the past has an effect on today. That's what it's saying. So again, when I'm going through this, and I hope I didn't go through this too quickly, but what I'm doing is trying to test, is it anything else? And what I'm showing is no, you see that the past is still affecting today, right? So there's a few policy implications. First, and this is more for nonprofits, not necessarily federal government. I know they can't get involved in it, but what I show, and I don't have time to talk about fully show my results, but what I show is that where there are more Blacks who attend historically Black churches, it weakens this relationship. And so what I actually think that is nonprofit groups, policy advocates groups, green roots organizations, they can actually partner with the Black church, right? Again, you can't necessarily make people go to church. I'm not saying that, but what I'm saying is that maybe, hey, maybe the church officials are respected people in the community. And so maybe they're the ones who should be talking about getting out to vote, right? The next thing I talk about is what is another policy implication? A key provision of the Voting Rights Act should be reinstated. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965, a key provision of it was overturned in 2013. And basically what that key provision said was, hey, these areas that had this history of discriminating against Blacks when it comes to voting, they had to get federal clearance from a court before they changed any laws when it came to voting, right? In 2013, that was overturned. Remember, my data stops in 2012. Why is that relevant? Because what I'm actually showing is that prior to that even being overturned, there's something that's going on. There's something that's going on. This group of people are not voting because of the past, and they still need to be protected. And that's not even looking at, again, the 2016 election, where stuff was changed, where polling places were now changed and they were moved and things of that nature. So this is actually prior to voter ID laws and all of those things that people talk about, that there's actually something that's going on among the Black community. And that's something that we actually need to figure out as a country to help to be. For me, I think about it in this way. We need a healthy democracy. Right. And if we need a healthy democracy, we need to understand why people are not voting. And this is actually showing that people are not voting because of the past. Right. And I know that was a quick ending, but I want to make sure we get to those questions. All right. So thank you all. And I'm going to stop sharing now.
All right, everybody, please give a virtual round of applause for Dr. Williams. Snaps, claps, whatever you might do at home. This was a fantastic talk, and we really appreciate that perspective that you brought. And so I'm gonna jump in with some questions. I want to ask anyone who has a question to go ahead and throw it in the Q&A. And I'll draw the first question from someone who asked, how much did Black voting change in the Obama era?
Oh God, it changed. It changed by, I want to say like 10 to 15 percentage points. So it changed a lot. But what I still show is that you still see this negative relationship. So you still see that the past is still having effects on reducing voter turnout. But Obama definitely did encourage Black voting for sure.
I'm looking to see if Jesse wants to jump in.
Well, I do. I mean, that was a fantastic talk, and I need to see this paper. I very much want to follow more of your work. So I'm just so grateful to have had the chance to be here. So I have a question because I'm thinking about voter intimidation now.
Yep.
And as I'm listening to you, what it's making me wonder is whether people who are already subject to this cultural inhibition to voting would therefore also be more vulnerable to threats of voter intimidation, right? Because as somebody who's done voting rights work for 20 years or so, what we see over and over again, and what we're seeing in a ratcheted up way for the current election, is prior to the election, there's a lot of talk and threats specifically about poll watchers. They're coming for you. They're going to be there. We're going to put people out there. They're going to be checking. There's going to be people with guns. And honestly, every national election, voting rights attorneys gear up for this. And it happens some, but nowhere near to the level of the talk beforehand. And I'm hopeful that that will be true again this time. But my big fear is it's the talk beforehand that keeps people away. And what your talk is suggesting to me is that keeping people away doesn't happen in an even Steven kind of a way. It would fall more heavily. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
You are right on point with everything that you just said. So one thing that I look at is, and so let me kind of back up a tad bit and kind of get to what you're saying as well. The way that I look at this is in two ways. Say, for instance, among the Black community, your great-great-great-grandfather didn't vote, right, because of lynchings. Mm-hmm. So he saw, they have these lynchings, and what they told him was, hey, you shouldn't vote. But it actually taught him something bigger than that. It actually taught him that he was not a part of society, right? And the reason why I say that is because by definition, lynchings are illegal killings. That's what they are by definition. By definition, that's what they are. Of the 3,000, 4,000 Black people who were lynched in these southern areas, no one was arrested for a crime. No one was charged with a crime, right? So what I'm saying is, think about that. What that's really saying is that my local officials won't protect me, right? So what I really think is the reason why this relationship has persisted, because people are always like, well, you're saying it's not all these things. How is it persisting? And I think it's persisting in a sense of people see current day things happening, and it makes them feel even more and more not a part of society. Right. So it's really one of those things when you talk about, again, poll watchers, and we're going to do this and we're going to do that. It again reinforces this idea that I am not a part of this society. Even though I'm born here, even though I have equal rights or full rights and everything, I'm still not a part of it. And so what I really think is that in a sense, it continues to persist because of that. And I think that certain areas, certain groups are more vulnerable to that. And so one thing that I would say is, and I mean, I eventually want to work on another paper that talks about this, but to talk about police shootings. Right. When you have areas and when you see the world looking at George Floyd, right, people look at it and say that everyone has the same reaction. And I go, no. There are certain areas that are more sensitive. There are certain areas that have this history of police shootings or whatever it is. And because of that, it makes them more disenfranchised. It makes them more feel like, see, again, my local officials won't protect me. I don't feel like a citizen. And it makes that, it keeps that relationship from continuing.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I want to get to some of the questions that the listeners have asked. Elizabeth Farmer asks, says she's curious what the remedies are. I think we are all wondering that. If we know about how these historical factors and continuing ripple effects affect voting, does it give us guidance on factors that can be influential for reversing these patterns?
Yeah. Oh, great question. So yeah, I used to talk about this and people are like, okay, you just depressed me for an hour. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Like, it's like, okay, like, I mean, can we do something about this? Right? No, totally true. So again, for me, I think it's one of those things where number one, we have to really understand that the history does matter. So that's the first thing. And because I think to some extent, people are like, it's in the past, let it go. And it's like, no. Statistically, I can show you it's not in the past. It's still affecting people, right? But what are things that I think that we can do now? First thing is, I think that we need to expand our voting methods. So the way that I view voting is that I look at lynchings as the original form of voter suppression. But the way in which I think that voting is suppressed now is by limiting the ways in which you can vote. Why do I say that? I've never met you all, right? But we are best friends now because we met virtually, right? We're using technology now. Think about it. This pandemic has actually allowed us to work from home. has allowed us to actually go to happy hours using technology. We've done so many different things. You can file your taxes using technology. But for whatever reason, when it comes to voting, no, you still got to go down to that polling location. You still got to stand in line. You still got to do whatever. And so I actually think that limiting your voting options are a means of voter suppression. So I live in DC right now, but my parents still live in Louisiana. My dad could vote by mail because he's a senior citizen, but my mom didn't fall in that category. So she still had to go stand in line. Right. And again, my mother is still, she's over 65, right? So she's still vulnerable. And especially when it comes to COVID. So thinking about it, really what you're asking my mother to do is to stand in this long line, knowing she has preconditions, all of these different things. You're really asking her to some extent risk her life again. And so it's really one of those things, again, seeing history and realizing it repeats itself, but in a different form. Again, I live in DC, so we can vote by mail. So I think it's a few things. One, everyone should be automatically registered to vote once they turn 18. Second thing, every state should have no excuse mail-in ballot voting. And again, I'm not talking about just because of the pandemic. It should just be the case. We're in America. This is the greatest country. Why can't we all not vote by mail? And the last thing, and this is the most controversial, what people don't like, but I'm going to say it. Also, vote by smartphone. So yes, there is a disparity in which we look at like home internet usage, but there's not a disparity in cell phones. Right? If you look across racial groups, about 71 and 73% of all races have smartphones. So to me, it's really one of those things where like, listen, the smartphones are tracking us anyway. Okay. They know everything we're doing anyway. Okay. Why can we not actually develop some type of secure system to make sure that people can actually just ballot comes to their phone, doop, 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 I'm done. Make it easier since we know that there's so many barriers to voting is my main thing.
That's really interesting about the cell phone usage. We have another question that relates to putting together today and the past. Shauna Fussell-Ware asks, do you think one day we'll be able to trace voter participation back to police brutality or white vigilante killings?
Yeah, to some extent I do. So one thing that I have done, I have traced lynchings to police shootings, but I haven't incorporated voting yet. But do I think it is? It will work, yes. So one paper that I'm working on right now with a friend of mine that works at Ohio State, we actually can show that areas that have more lynchings in the past, that they are more likely to have Blacks who are killed by police officers compared to whites in those areas, right? And again, I think that is one of those things where what does it go into? It goes into mistrust. And what I really think is going on is that there is a huge mistrust in the Black community. Right. And so there's mistrust in politicians, there's mistrust in police officers, there's mistrust in so many different avenues. And when you have all these layers of mistrust, guess what that means? You feel like you're not a part of society. And guess what you do when you feel like you're a part of society? You vote. Guess what you do when you feel like you're not a part of society? You don't vote. And so I just want, one other thing I want to say, because I know we want to get more questions. One thing I really want to say as well is that I think the way in which we look at things has to change to some extent. And I only say that because I went down this avenue because honestly, I have family members who don't vote. I mean, we're going to hope that they vote November 3rd because we keep pushing, right? But I have family members who don't vote. And none of them ever said, I don't vote because of voter ID laws, because of gerrymandering. Now, let's be clear. That stuff suppresses voting. I'm not saying it doesn't. But what I'm saying is that I think that there's an elephant in the room that no one has talked about. And what I'm saying is that, yes, those things suppress voting, but also these past racist acts have continued to make people feel like they're not a part of society. And so when you have police killings, when you have stuff, it just reinforces that fact. Sorry, my dog is whining and crying for whatever reason. So if you hear something, that's my dog in the background.
Luckily, mine seems to be sleeping. I want to try to combine a couple of these questions. I think you were already talking about mail-in voting with your parents' case, and someone asked, will we see a surge in voting due to the push in mail-in ballots? Does that equate with less voter intimidation? And then that kind of connects with the next question, asking if you're encouraged about the number of people who've registered to vote and are turning out now in record numbers for early voting. Do you feel they're empowered to use their vote because of the current climate, kind of running against the intimidation issue?
Yeah. Yeah, honestly, I am very encouraged, and I continue to be encouraged, even to the point where, again, I have family members who haven't voted and they swear that they're going to vote this time. You know, so you see people like, to bring up hip hop culture, you see people like Snoop Dogg saying, this is the first time I voted. You see people like Shaq saying, this is the first time I voted, right? So you're seeing stuff like that. And I think what it's doing is it's helping people to say like, hey, listen, let's stop condemning people from not voting. Let's just get them to vote. So, okay, you didn't vote in the past, but are you going to vote now, right? And so I am encouraged by that. What was the first? I forgot the first part of the question, and I know Jay wants to jump in as well.
Well, I think the first part was about mail-in voting and whether that works to reduce intimidation.
Yeah, I think it definitely does, and I think also during this pandemic, it just helps people who don't want to get the virus for sure. Like for me, it was so easy that the ballot was just in my mailbox, and I just fill it out and mail it back. For me, it's really one of those things where I think it really will encourage voting, and I hope it does for sure.
So someone asked, and I think you pretty much answered this, why 2016 wasn't included, and could we speak to this and the impact this year?
Yeah, sure. So if I'm being totally honest, the real reason 2016 wasn't included is because I started this project in like 2014, and I've been going over it like this is like oh my god, like I've been working on this project for like 4 years. A little over 4 years, whatever. But the point is I've been working on it for a long time. So really what happened was the 2016 election hadn't happened. And I decided to not include it only because of that key change in the Voting Rights Act. In 2013, when he overcame that, what I didn't want to do now is actually say that, hey, like because people can now change their polling laws and stuff like that, that would have an effect. So I was basically trying to make sure that I didn't capture that as well.
Yeah, makes sense.
I want to jump in. First of all, you know, I think Dr. Williams, you got probably 7 more papers just based on 2016.
Yeah.
Thereafter, regression, discontinuity, you got everything coming forward. So we're looking forward to that. I want to highlight the fact that going on what you were saying about the Black voter registration levels back in the Reconstruction era, that was astounding.
Yeah.
I know we've covered some other findings that are centered at like the Black political representation in the South at that time was incredible.
Yes.
I know Michelle Alexander has pointed out that there were higher proportion of Black elected officials in the South in 1870 than there were in 1980.
Yes.
And that you had a majority Black state legislature in South Carolina. You had 4 out of the 5 state executives Black in South Carolina. So this voting suppression is extremely powerful. And I wanted to bring that historical perspective, and we're almost out of time. People want to know where they can follow your work and stay abreast of what you're working on.
Yeah, sure. So the good thing is I have a very unique name. So if you Google my name, I'm the only person that's going to come up. So like, yeah, if you Google my name, Rand actually has a link to my website. And so on the website is my paper. So I have a paper about Confederate symbols, which is really good paper in my opinion, but I wrote it. I have a paper about voting. I have blogs that I've written about police shootings, and again, linking those to lynchings. So yeah, just Google my name, go to Rand's website, and you'll get the link to my actual personal Google site.
Fantastic. And Professor Allen, do you want to talk about your event tonight? Because you're having a very important event.
Well, just so people know, and we will record it if they can't make it, and I could stick a link in the chat, or we could maybe connect the flyer. I've been encouraging Pitt students and everybody to sign up both as poll workers and as election protection volunteers. One response to voter intimidation is a national consortium of groups run what's called election protection. That's the 1-866-hour vote thing that you may have seen, where people are asked to report problems, but they run nationwide volunteers standing outside of polling places, just observing and checking in with people. And if they catch problems, reporting them, and then election authorities and others can be alerted. So in conjunction with this push, I've been doing some voting rights trainings. They don't replace the trainings that the county does and that election protection does, but they just bring up, I figured if I'm going to be telling people to do this, I'd like them to know about some things that I think are important from my experience, perennial voting rights issues. And frankly, my training is primarily focused on intimidation. So I'm doing one of those tonight at 7 o'clock. It's open to the public. There's a Zoom link. I think you pushed it out on Twitter. It's up on the Pitt calendar if anybody wants to come. And we're also going to record it and figure out a way to get it out.
Thank you. And that's completely open to the public. Yes, it's on
absolutely
the website, and you can link right to it. You don't have to register. It'll bring you right in at 7 o'clock. one more person to thank for today. The United Way of Southwestern Pennsylvania has sponsored and collaborated to bring this event to you today. And I want to thank Dr. Williams again for this incredible presentation. We're all empowered now. We have 2 weeks to go out there, empower ourselves, empower those around us. And this was the first event in many today. Stay with us on Facebook, facebook.com/pit. And you can follow all these events all day. At 12 o'clock, we'll have Claire Malone from 538.com. She's going to give us a perspective on how race and engagement with racial groups has played out in the Democratic and Republican Party over the last 50 years. Extremely powerful. And so you don't want to miss that. And then at 2 p.m., there was a question about voting technology and voting security. And I mean, those are big questions. We have a panel of experts, including Ron Bandis, who is a voting security expert, who will be able to speak to that. Bhavini Patil was a voting technology expert who can speak to that. And Gina McClendon, who is a voter suppression expert. And so you don't want to miss any of these events. Follow us at facebook.com/PitChris. Dr. Williams, thank you. Professor Allen, thank you. Thank you, United Way. Thank you, Pitt. And thank you, Provo School of Social Work. We'll see you in just a couple of in another hour. We'll be back. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thanks again. That was great.
Thank you. See ya.